Okay, today is Sunday, April 27th, 2014. I'm Don Wunsch. I'm the Mary Kay Finley, Missouri Professor of Computer Engineering at Missouri University of Science and Technology, and we are in Newton, Massachusetts, where we are interviewing Gail Carpenter of Boston University. And so this is the IEEE Computational Intelligence Society History Committee interview series. Gail has many notable accomplishments which will come out during the time of the interview. In particular, she's a fellow of the IEEE and an IEEE Pioneer Award winner, and also had many seminal contributions to the International Neural Network Society as well. We've both served on the board together for a number of years, and she's one of the founding board members, I believe. Mm-hmm. So with that, we'll just launch into our questions. So Gail, would you tell us about your formal education and training?
Okay, well, in high school, I'm a graduate of the International School of Geneva. And then I went to college. I graduated from the University of Colorado in Boulder in 1970 with a degree in mathematics. And then I went for 4 years to graduate school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison and got my PhD in 1974, also in mathematics.
Great. And you had an NSF graduate fellowship there.
I did.
Oh, good,
yes.
Good. So what was your first job in science?
I was an instructor in mathematics at MIT.
Great. And when was your first paper published, and what publication and what title?
Okay, I have two possible answers. If you're thinking about my first journal publication, is that the intent?
Either one.
Okay, well, the first journal publication was in the Journal of Differential Equations, and it was based on my PhD thesis, and its title was A Geometric Approach to Singular Perturbation Problems with Applications to Nerve Impulse Equations. The year before, that was published in 1976, I had a book chapter called Nerve Impulse Equations, which was a piece of the thesis in a book called Structural Stability, the Theory of Catastrophes and Applications in the Sciences. One of the aspects of our field from that time that's sometimes called the Dark Ages of neural modeling, when artificial intelligence was in its ascendancy, after the Minsky-Papert book, which was published just before I went to graduate school. One of the things that was actually quite wonderful is being in a very small field and not even having a field. The conferences would be very broadly based and very interesting. And this was a conference in Seattle. The book chapter was from a conference in Seattle at the Battelle Research Center that was based around catastrophe theory, and Renee Thom, who was at the conference, which was very much, there was a lot of interest in catastrophe theory. Now, I didn't do catastrophe theory in the abstract, but some of the methods that I'd used in my analysis of the nerve equations had to do with singular perturbations, which entail very rapid transitions, and that's one of the hallmarks of catastrophe theory. So that was officially my first publication.
Well, another hallmark of catastrophes is that certain people's nerve impulses are maybe the primary cause of a lot of the catastrophes.
Yeah. Don't get me started.
You probably hear that one a lot.
In fact, we could probably blame all of humanity's foibles or other things on those, but yeah. We all know that.
Okay. So what persuaded you to study engineering and science, in your case, science and math?
Okay. Well, I saw your list, and it led me to think about that. And depends how far back you go. But what I was really thinking of, and it's one reason I mentioned the International School in Geneva, where I was a student from 1961 until I graduated from high school in 1966. And I had a very wonderful science teacher named Eric Anthony. And he taught chemistry, but it was really about the joy of doing science. And in fact, I went to college thinking, oh, I love chemistry. That's what I want to be a major. I went saying I'm going to be a chemistry major. And I discovered when I went to college that I really was not cut out for labs as they were done in much more extended settings. And what I didn't realize at the time, because I couldn't put a name on it, is what I really loved doing was theoretical science. And that notion that you could do science without having to spend all day with chemicals in a laboratory or other things like that. Hang on a second. Let me just shut that off.
Actually, I don't know how to pause it. So.
No, I can. I think I shut it off.
I'm worried
sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. Whoops. Kind of. Okay. Hope it got you. Sorry. I don't know how to make it. Here, let me answer it, and then hang up. Okay. I think I did it. Sorry. Okay. And of course, theoretical science is where I ended up. So from chemistry, I migrated to mathematics, and that's where I stayed. And I'm not sure where that would have gone, but again, in college at Colorado, my junior year, I had another really wonderful teacher who's still at Colorado in math named Kent Goodrich. And I took a class in analysis with him, which was with the Moore method, which had been developed in Texas. And I also took graduate school classes in that. But I think like a lot of people who end up really going into mathematics, the Moore method, where the whole class is getting a list of lemmas and theorems. That's it. You don't look anything up, no books. It's unheard of that anyone would go look up. But it's very beautifully structured. So you go home, you work on these things, you come into class, they say, okay, who has lemma of 4.1? You raise your hand if you think you do. And the students go up to the board. And it really was enlightening because it's so different from how mathematics is usually taught. And it was just wonderful. And by my senior year, I was thinking, oh, just go to graduate school in math. It seemed like what I just love doing that, and the rest is history, I guess.
Wow, no kidding. Wow. And so I guess that would be one of the people who influenced your decision, the professor that you mentioned. Are there some other people that you wanted to mention who influenced your decision?
To go to graduate school, into science. Well, in a way, it was sort of accidental because I was studying really pure mathematics in the general curriculum. One day I was sitting next to one of my fellow students who was a friend who told me about an amazing thing. He was taking an engineering class from Al Scott, who was at engineering in Wisconsin, who I had not met at that point. And he said he just learned about a differential equation that described a nerve impulse. And that just seemed wild. And he sat next to me and he wrote it out. And I just thought that was amazing. And then class started and things moved on. But that ended up being what I did my PhD thesis on, the Hodgkin-Huxley equation, which in a way, having heard about it, kind of primed me. So when I heard about it again, so in a way, that was the beginning of moving into what you could call science and engineering, because my PhD thesis advisor, who was a wonderful mathematician named Charles Conley at Wisconsin, had maybe 18 PhD students.
Wow.
And by the time he was 40, he had lots and lots of students And all the others went into, to the best of my knowledge, pure math. They basically did math, and by having sort of the crossed wires there, I've always felt that mathematics has been really the fundamental of my everything else that I've done, whether you call it science or engineering. It doesn't usually look like what my mathematical colleagues call mathematics, because it doesn't look difficult or abstract or fancy enough. But I've always felt that the ability to concentrate ideas and write them in the form of models, which entails having to visualize them, goes back to my mathematical training. That first paper I mentioned was a geometric approach. It was very topological, very visual and geometric. And where that comes in is you need, in order to, there are lots of ways to do mathematics, and this was one of the ways that worked for me. And it was to visualize these dynamics as an actual, almost like moving through rooms, or the dynamics were these flows of numbers, but they were in higher dimensions than just one. And that all goes back to my basic math training, but then I got more and more interested in the science, and then I was lucky to go, my first job was teaching in a math department, and there I was at MIT, and there was a wonderful, although it was all, I mentioned AI, Minsky Pepper, they were there then, and so even though they were there, and I said, okay, there was a wonderful seminar in, I think we called it mathematical biology. It wasn't just neural models. Steve was there already, and there were several others of us, and we had a seminar, and people from MIT and from some people from other places in Boston, we got together every week or two, and somebody would talk about something very of lots of applications. And of course, even the mathematics at MIT was very applied and geared toward engineering and applications, which to the engineers out there, that might sound very obvious, but believe me, believe me, there's an entire world of mathematics that has that. I believe it does have the ties over to engineering if you're able to, but if you just listen to the daily chat, you'd never know what those ties actually were. So being at a place where it just seems self-evident that even the most abstract, there were of course pure mathematicians at MIT, but you were embedded in a world where you didn't have to necessarily do applications, but it wasn't just completely separate. It was all part of the family that you were part of there. So I'd say that, and then I just kept going in that direction, kind of orthogonal, and all my advisors, other students, went in a different direction.
Good. So, well, that kind of covered some of the things on my list about when you got involved in computational intelligence core technology and what triggered your jump into that. So this modeling of Hodgkin and Huxley, was this what you'd call your first computational intelligence related activity? Yes,
and then for several years after my PhD, I'd say right through when I became a tenured professor at Northeastern. So for several years after, I did more work that was either that or closely related. So it was, if you will, neural models in the small. It's either single cells or very small networks of cells, not the larger scale things that we think of as neural networks. In fact, it was more what's now called computational neuroscience, which tends to focus more on the cellular level rather than the large scale, though that's a big generalization right there, but just the way our field gets talked about.
Right.
So that I really came from that direction,
Mm-hmm.
more than the big networks. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
start with that. They kept getting bigger and bigger.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
they
Good.
started small. So for several years, that's what I did, and I did
Uh,
a series of different papers with different dynamics.
mm-hmm. Um, so, what was the major challenge that you faced in your pioneering research? And this is a question
Mm-hmm.
for uh, Neural Net Pioneer Award winners, which, as we've mentioned, you are. Um, I think that you can interpret that as broadly as you
Yeah.
want. So you can talk about the things for which you were cited of your Pioneer Award, or you can talk more
Mm-hmm.
broadly about just what were the major challenges you felt as the questions you were investigating really started to get it to this point of, a lot of traction, a lot of progress, and a lot of challenges to try to get there.
Mm. Okay. Um, so when I first saw the question, which was before you elaborated, I was thinking first that the field was so very microscopic.
Mm-hmm.
But then the second part of my thought was that that was really a blessing in many ways. And when I talk with, for example, my students about their future, I'll sometimes say something along the lines, you mentioned the word pioneer. Now, pioneers don't go to the middle of Manhattan usually,
Right.
although
Yeah.
I'm sure you could say, well, there's a pioneer in some field and have a similar thing. But let's say going back to a couple hundred years, pioneers go out to the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
Now, one of the there's a lot of benefits to that if that's what fits your temperament.
Mm-hmm.
And it seemed to fit mine very nicely, is there are many problems out there on the frontier that have not been done that are wonderful problems. Again, I'm thinking of advising students or even prospective students who are thinking of coming into our field that can be done even if you're not Einstein.
Right.
And when I was very young and thinking about different fields of science, I mean, I always knew that I had no interest in going to physics. I had no intuition, but also I felt it was, maybe wrongly, that it was so picked over that in a way that's what I think of as the urban model, that there are many people, maybe thousands, working on some great problems, say at a given time in history. The really nice thing about that is if you make progress, if you find that piece of the puzzle that everyone's looking for, you can get immediate recognition that everyone realizes, oh, you found the piece of the puzzle that we've all been looking for. That's wonderful. There it is. Great. That's what I think of as the urban model. And some people thrive in that.
Mm-hmm.
Other people love to go out on the frontier, and there's plenty for everybody. Everyone can homestead. Lots of students who might not be the Einsteins can make wonderful contributions just because nobody's gone out there and cleared the land and tilled the field. They can solve wonderful problems just because nobody's gone there before.
And the urban model person would wither there. They only survived because there was a pioneer before them. Like the Copernican revolution would never have gotten anywhere without Tycho Brahe, for example.
Yeah, and maybe people could be both. I don't know. But the downside of being out there in the middle of nowhere is you say, hey, and you look around, there's nobody there to give you. So if you really need lots of immediate applause and recognition, if you're working out there in your little homestead and you've grown this beautiful field, they might not notice, at least not right at first. So you need to recognize that if that's the mode you're going to do. But I would talk to my friends in physics who talked about they get a little result and they'd have to stay up all night and submit it to physical reviews by the next morning because they were sure that by the next morning somebody else was going to have solved it. And when I would hear them talk that way, I'd think, well, who needs me? I'll just wait for them to do it tomorrow. I'll go and try to do some things that maybe people aren't going to do. And so I never really felt that kind of urgency to, better write it up right away because somebody else is going to discover this immediately, or I can't talk about it or anything. They're going to realize that it's the key to it's the missing piece. And I really thrived. I loved that way of working. And I just think they're different. They're two different things. They're complementary, and they're good. And now our field has become much more, the original, maybe in Missouri, right, where there were homesteads. Now there's St. Louis and Kansas City and all those other big cities that weren't quite so big back in those days. And our field has grown in ways that were really unthinkable back in the 70s and until really the mid-80s, when the onset of the wide availability of large computers. Of course, what we had back in the 80s looked pathetic compared to what's on our iPhone now, but they'd already sent men to the moon in the 60s, but they weren't on desktops and available, and at least to engineers. I've always credited engineers with bringing our field from really people who could work in the modeling domain without computers. Computers were there, people used them some, I used them some, sort of in a very illustrative way. You'd kind of do something to demonstrate your model, but they weren't used in a discovery or implementation process by thousands of people until the mid-80s. It's kind of, we all know.
Yeah.
I think probably anybody listening to this knows that story about that starting, I guess, almost 30 years ago now.
Yeah, which was a great time for your papers, for some of which were part of maybe the later work for which your Pioneer Award was cited, like the 87 Art 1 paper and that kind of stuff.
Right. I think the two pieces of work that were cited for that were first the single nerve cell work that went back to through the 70s, and then the adaptive resonance theory work, which continued then.
Yeah, that's
for
my
decades.
recollection too.
Yeah. So the first, Steve had introduced adaptive resonance as a theory of cognitive information processing, but there was no art model until actually we filed a patent in 1985. That was, so Art 1, the official archival thing, wasn't published till 87, but that paper was submitted to a special issue and accepted in 85. But they then waited for all those late papers to come into the journal, so it didn't appear till 87, but it was really published, and it was published in some smaller venues like Proceedings in 85.
It was the end of 85 or start of 86 when I started getting attracted to that body of research as a student. So what contribution, this is a hard question, but you've seen it, what contribution gives you the greatest satisfaction?
That was a tough one, and I can't even remember. I had trouble with that. But I'll tell you what I wrote down here, because in a way there's so many. But then I started thinking about this, and one of the themes that our wonderful Rabbi Howard Berman is always talking about is life as a journey from beginning to end, and to focus on the journey rather than the goal. And that's what I thought of as I was trying to grapple with that question. The most satisfaction really has been the journey, and it's been a privilege to be on this for, talk about Moses and 40 years. It's been almost now a little over 40 years, but it's really been a wonderful lifelong journey, and that's taken, I think, all of us in the field, no matter when you started on the track, in wonderful directions that were really quite very unexpected. I mean, back in the 70s and early 80s. Well, one of the real turning points was the wonderful conference that David Hustonese and Robert Heck Nielsen put together at Arizona State in 1983, before the real takeoff. And that was amazing. There were about 100 people there. It was a wonderful week-long conference. And it was thrilling and amazing that there were actually 100 people there for a week to talk about this.
Was that where David Hustonese published that paper, How Brains Work, the Next Great Scientific
No,
Revolution?
I think he might have done that even a little bit before that.
Okay.
Now, David Hustonese was Robert Heck Nielsen's PhD thesis advisor at Arizona State, and they were still there, although I think Robert might have, was he at Raytheon then already? I think he might have. But he was still in the Phoenix area.
I don't think it was Raytheon, the name of, he was at TRW. Robert was.
Later.
Oh, okay, maybe earlier.
This was when he was still in Arizona.
Still in Arizona. Okay, probably so. I'll get the chance
You have to ask him. This would have been in 83.
Yeah, okay.
In the early 83, I think April of 83. It was anyway, it was at Tempe at Arizona State. And, I mean, now a conference with 100 people is kind of, well, it's small.
Tiny,
and they're conferences that are in every field practically, that aren't just narrowly in our, I mean, what you would call a neural is fuzzy and machine learning and computational intelligence, which is the name of this society here. And there's such wonderful mixing of the different ideas from different directions.
Well, in fact, that's a really good fit for the next question. What do you think the impact that the Computational Intelligence Society or Neural Network Society, or back in the Neural Network Council was what it was called, and also the International Neural Network Society has made on you? And the flip side of that, the next question after that, is the impact that you've made on that community. So they might weave together, but those are...
Well, it's been part of the whole process of the maturation of the field, going from really always being somebody else's guest. You would be a speaker in kind of an oddball topic in a math meeting or something like that, and hanging on to the fringes. Or else it was a very broad meeting, like mathematical biology in a place like a Gordon conference, something like that.
Yeah.
So, this was before the mid-'80s. So, to start to make the transition, I mean, any bona fide field has societies and journals and the infrastructure of a field. And so having that, of course, sustains and supports all of us, and including people who don't even know these fields exist, but who benefit from some of the fruits of that. It's like building a university, or, you know, I mean, before that people might have been talking, but hey, let's make this more of an institution. So it's all been very exciting.
Good, yeah, because you were, I think you were on the founding board of the INNS, yes. And
right, and I was on the board continuously. I was kept reelected through terms until I got, we voted in term limits, so I reached my term limit, and now I'm a fellow, as of course you are, of that. So in a way, I guess it's on the board for life. In this,
it is. It's you're welcome to any of our board meetings, and so that was founded in 1987, and I think you were on the board until what, 2011 or something like that, or 2012.
About that, I'd have to look exactly, but let's call it 2012. That's a nice round number of years. Well, that's a wonderful service to the community and the journal and the society and all. And of course, it's been a joy. You get to a certain age, and you go to all these things, and you see your friends. Like talking to my friend Don here. You know, it's really the delightful part of having things like that. You get to know the people, and then meet young people who come from all over the world. I mean, that's wonderful too.
Yeah, it really is great. And I met you in 1987. Met Stephen in '86. Met you soon after in '87, and spent the summer here. And we got a lot of chance to get to
before
know each
you
other
even went to graduate school.
Well, I just finished my master's. It was just before I started my PhD program, and so that was a wonderful time to get a real shot in the arm for me. What impact has our society, and by that I mean broadly the INNS and the IEEE CIS, made in engineering and science from your point of view?
Oh, more than I would have ever dreamed of, and more than anyone I know, with the possible exception of Robert Heck Nielsen, who was back then viewed as a wide-eyed visionary, would have dreamed, with the possible exception of him. I mean, it's just permeated. In some ways you could say, well, given how big it is, why aren't these societies even bigger and bigger and bigger? I view it as sort of the price of success. It's because we're no longer, first we were what Steve sometimes calls tenant farmers. We could have our little plot over here. We didn't, and then we had our societies, and they grew quickly. It was wonderful. But now the methods have pervaded so many fields that they've permeated practically everything that you could name, especially if you include machine learning. Let me just check. So, and I want to go back. I just saw something from your previous, but okay. I'll try to answer this first. I don't skip around. So, for example, I'll give you one example that's not an obvious and maybe an obvious engineering example. I just finished reading a book on modern finance by Michael Lewis called Flash Boys. And I recommend this book. It's quite amazing. At least it was to me.
Okay, I'll read it.
And it's really about drastic changes in the world of finance just in the last 4 or 5 years. Very recent. And it all has to do with things that, for example, over the last decade or even earlier, I spent a lot of time with my students in seminars. That wasn't my field, finance, but we looked at a lot of the interesting applications in stock market prediction, things that really grab students' interest, and mathematical finance. And it was clear even back then, and I'm sure it was clear to many people, that the world of prediction was going in these very tiny, because once something got out, it immediately got gobbled. Right. Once there was the slightest difference. And if you knew anything about machine learning, and even 10 years ago, speed, that was where, maybe not all the action, I like to think there's a lot of value in all of that, but it was, in terms of actually using machine learning for prediction, it was going to be on this micro time scale. But where that went is something that I certainly had a clue about, and apparently a lot of people did not. But permeating all this is machine learning. I mean, that's in a way our field. I'm not saying they use brain models, or I don't even know what models. It's hard to find out exactly what they're doing.
Right, but it's certainly inspired by a lot of the work that our community's been thinking about.
And some of our PhD students went into that area more than a decade ago, and as did thousands of other people who were formerly in engineering, mathematics, computers, who didn't seem to come from the world of finance, and now it's bearing fruit, for better or worse. And then, of course, on a somewhat longer time scale, I think, of course, robotics, which robotics you could think of as sort of the machine embodiment of every kind of human-based brain and motor, sensory motor, cognitive system could potentially go into a robotic system. And just the last couple of years, it seems that robotic embodiments and actual fielded systems in robotics have become quite amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed that, at least I don't work directly in robotics, but it seemed that for quite a long time it had just sort of stayed at a certain level, and it was getting really good at things like arms that were on conveyor belts that could pick up things, and kind of static, very controlled, and very useful, but not having the kind of humanoid embodiment that all of a sudden, it's the last couple of years, it seems that every time I look at the tech section in the paper, there's another one there.
Well, particularly after the very highly publicized takeovers, such as, I think, was it Boston Dynamics that Google took over?
That was they were doing thermostats or something, but
that's a different one.
Or that was they just got taken over by somebody. I don't remember.
Yeah, that was Google. I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
but they were doing the person who was running that.
Yeah, she was running a neuroscience program at the University of Washington, and she quit that to go with a startup company that was soon after in a $1 billion plus takeover from Google. But several robotics companies recently got swallowed up.
But
too.
I mean, just that example, the thermostats, is run by somebody who had been in neuroscience. I mean, you don't know exactly what they're doing, but
you can bet
it has some connection. Or why did they take that company as opposed to 1,000 others?
Yeah. But you wanted to return to something.
Yeah, I guess it was the well, I don't remember what the question is, but I wrote it under what impact has our society made in engineering and science, and I let me just see. Anyway, I just wanted to mention how wonderful it was. You mentioned Tom Caudell earlier, that starting in the mid '80s, he really was a pioneer in taking the models. And I remember distinctly having a conversation with him. This is back when he was at Hughes Aircraft in the Los Angeles area, and even before the Art 1 model was published, I met him here. He had heard about talks, and things were out there before the papers actually appeared, and he was already putting it into things at Hughes. And then shortly after, he moved to the Seattle area and joined Boeing. And I guess is that where you first met
he
him?
started collaborating with me and Mike Healy, and pretty soon Mike Healy came to me and said, you know that new guy Tom Caudell, we need to make him the PI on the project that we're working on. And I said, he's that good, huh? He said, yeah, he really is that good. And he did. He'd had a Midas touch. Everything he works on turns to gold, and he's still that way.
And as I think you know, that was one of the very early technology transfers of a basic model, the Art 1 model, that was developed for cognitive learning and online based on human, and it was then dramatically developed and implemented in the Boeing part design and retrieval system in manufacturing. And it quickly on the timescale of a few years, it was there on the Boeing floor, and I had the chance to see it there when I was doing some consulting with you all there over a few years at Boeing, and it was quite wonderful to see that happening.
Right. Yeah. I left Boeing in '93, and Tom left, I think, 1 year later. But during that period, from about around '87 to '93, a lot of great things happened. And one of the neat things about that contribution was it really used the scalability of art. Mm-hmm. So art scales up really well to a very large number of neurons if you want, and that may be taken for granted now with the increased computational power that was available, but at the time, that is now available, but at the time, that was the largest number of input elements.
I think it was 1 million. It was in 3D.
It was 64 million.
See, okay.
And
okay.
that was, that was around
8,000 by 8,000.
Yeah, so this was starting to get traction before 1990, and it was published in about 94. But well, no, there were some things published in like 92 or 93 in conferences, and so that really scaled up really well.
Yeah. So, and I'd often say, I mean, even then there were quite a few choices. Even if you were interested in the neural systems, and backpropagation was very popular, and somebody said, "Oh, we're using it," and I'd always say, "Well, why? You know, there's a lot about it. Why did you choose this one?" I remember the answer there, and the number was, it scales, but the reason that it could be arbitrarily large is there was a fundamental design principle before there was even a model, which was stability of the learning, so that you could keep pouring new things in without worrying that the basic learning that you'd initially trained it in would become all messed up, because the whole idea is that the engineers, as they were using it, could continue the training, and various engineers in a very distributed way, even back almost, at least 25 years ago, could use this in that way, and because it was the basic provable design of those systems, you could use it with confidence. And I remember the notion of vigilance was used in a fundamental way in that implementation, because it was a single parameter that allowed the engineer to try to retrieve parts, but then maybe they got 1,000 come back, and they did all they needed to do was, okay, then you increase vigilance and you're going to get fewer, so they could just, with a twist of a knob, if you will, get to roughly the right number of parts that they could then reasonably examine and see if there was one that was close enough to the part they actually wanted to design.
Yeah, and that really was a wonderful application at Boeing. It got a lot of good visibility. So, how do you envision the evolution of computational intelligence technologies? Do you see any confluence or any potential new entry?
Yeah, again, I just got this list this morning, but I did think about it a little. Some of these questions were a lot harder than others, including this one. And, I mean, I think there's a lot of what's going on now, which will continue, and in a way it's really in its, maybe not its infancy, but maybe getting into adolescence of machine learning. And I think that's going to continue in huge ways. But that's already kind of on the way. It's almost going to college. But so what else is there? Well, not surprisingly, the actual models that are there and very widely used are, by and large, to the best of my knowledge, although it's sometimes very hard to know what exactly is inside the black box. But as far as I know, many of the models that have been introduced, especially over the last 30 years, that are really brain-based, have never been used in a big way in applications. And I think there's a huge library of models of all sorts that aren't just all ready to plug into an application. But I think the Boeing has always been a kind of, from the 80s, a quintessential tech transfer, that you have this. And then it takes a huge amount more work and creativity to adapt and embed these in the right application. So I think, but there's a lot of those models that are still at the Art 1 stage that are doing all kinds of things that are really based on the brain. Many of the applications go back to things that are, go way back. And I mean, I think we all know one of the huge successes is Bayes, but Bayes was introduced hundreds of years ago in its core technology, the basic equation and approach. And many other kind of machine learning are quite statistically based. One of the aspects of brain models of let's say, learning models, and it was one of the things about the art models that if you want to have so-called fast, stable, fast learning, it's not just learning with hundreds of thousands, millions of examples, but how do you deal with one or two or three and get going and then adapt when you need to, but not mess up important things from early on, learning really in real time without many samples to begin with, where if something's going off to the unknown, exploring planets, or I don't know, maybe in a disaster kind of situation where the whole point, if we knew what was going to happen, we wouldn't have happened. We would have made sure it didn't happen. So you really don't know what's going to happen, and how can you send something in that not only is not going to get somebody killed, but actually be able to do something other than just take pictures. And the exploring other planets has the feature of you can't just communicate on a moment-to-moment basis. You have to have it be able to make judgments as if it were a person. Or let's say even on satellites. Or
even as if it were an ant or a fly, a lot of computers are stupider even than insects right now still. And so anything that could give it a little bit of that autonomy and that learning capability would go a long way towards improving our ability to do some of the things that we'd like to see happen in the future.
So one of the buzzwords of the moment, of course, is big data. And we all know big data is out there, but that's all it is to begin with. And of course the brain is wonderfully adapted. You open your eyes, you're dealing with big data from the moment you're born, and how the brain is able to use that to pick and choose, especially use attention, and then fit that in with sensory, motor, emotional, cognitive, all of these things that could be integrated into a actual system. So it's picking and choosing from among all that big data that's out there. And I mean, I love my spam filter, and I'm thrilled. And as far as I know, it's based on Bayesian, and it has more samples than I like to think about. And that's wonderful, and it's great. But there are other domains that don't have that kind of
we're like living spam filters when you think about it, because when you think about the object of attention, then you want everything else to be shuttered out. On the other hand, there are important things that can shift the priority of something right away, and it could be.
The spam filter has to learn everything. I mean, it can't just learn about what I care about and throw everything else away. It needs to really look at every email that comes in. So it can't just zoom in on what it thinks is, at least as far as I know, how it works. But anyway. So that's I guess the summary of that is over on a timescale of decades, implementing some of the brain-based models, not only the ones that will be created in the future, these will continue, but the ones that are already sitting there in the literature, going back in some cases decades. And I think there's a lot of potential energy in those models that over the years, at least some of them, will get picked up and used.
And so have we segued into the question about, do you predict any scientific or technological breakthrough involving computational intelligence technology?
I guess if you combine the robotics with the more truly brain-based, or not even more truly, but additional brain-based models, that'll lead in the direction of more and more human-like capabilities for some of these systems.
And any final comments? Anything that has...
I guess
crossed your mind?
it's just been a wonderful journey. I mean, it's been a real joy to be lucky enough to be in this, what happened to have been a pioneering field that I kind of stumbled upon, as many, if not all of us, did back in the day, and that it's been such a wonderful process of seeing it happen, which might not have happened in some of the institutions. And also I want to thank some of the key, we didn't talk about grant funding, so there were a few key program managers.
Like which?
Well, John Tangney at Air Force and Harold Hawkins at ONR, for example, who were funding key interdisciplinary investigators back in the early 80s or late 70s, when this was, let's say early 80s and on, when NSF and NIH were much more compartmentalized. Interdisciplinary work was not being funded very much in some of the DoD funding not just the agencies, but the individual program managers who really saw this as a lapse in the not a lapse, but a gap in the major, more traditional funding areas. They changed our life, and I think they really changed the development of the field.
Oh, absolutely. You have to be able to pay the grad students. The conferences won't survive unless somebody has a travel budget and so on. And so without those funding agencies, none of this great stuff happens.
But to fund stuff when it's still not popular,
right,
takes a lot of imagination.
Yeah, you're funding that person who's outstanding in the field, for that homesteader analogy.
Before there was but that kind of field, but there wasn't even a field.
Right, they're outstanding in a field that is
the other kind of field.
They're like somebody outstanding in the middle of the field.
Standing in the field, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. I've enjoyed doing this.
Well, thank you so much. I've enjoyed it too, and you've certainly been an important pioneer to the field for a lot of people, including me, and so it's a real privilege that you let me come here to your home and do this interview. So
thanks, Don. That's great. Thanks.